Good afternoon, everyone. I don't know about you, but this morning gave me a lot to think about. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Kupchan. Dr. Kupchan is Senior Fellow for Europe Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also Professor of International Affairs at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. The author of several books, including his latest, How Enemies Become Friends. His government service included a position as the Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council during the first Clinton administration, as well as serving on the policy planning staff for the State Department. It's an honor for us to have him here today, Dr. Charles Kupchan.
Thank you very much, Admiral, for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure and an honor to have about an hour to open a conversation with you about one of the most interesting and dynamic aspects of American foreign policy today, and that is President Obama's effort to engage unfriendly regimes, to talk to the enemy, to see if it's possible to fashion the kind of rapprochement and understanding that, let's say, the U.S. fashioned with the UK at the turn of the century that Professor Strauss talked about this morning. Can we do that with Iran, with Russia, with Venezuela, with Cuba, with a number of countries with which the United States has difficult relations? I'm going to back my way into that question by asking a slightly different question, and then at the end of my remarks coming back to where we are today. And the framework that I want to put on the table for discussion is the question of how is it that enemies become friends? How is it that conceptually, historically, long-standing rivals find their way to peace? And I think it's interesting that the Naval War College has decided to focus on this, in part because we don't know much about that. Most of the work in international relations, whether by historians, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, tends to be about war. If you pick up the local newspaper, whether Newport or Providence or the Washington Post or the New York Times, you can bet that, especially these days, there will be a couple articles about war. And that's because we're fighting in Iraq, we're fighting in Afghanistan. We've got other places where trouble is a brew, the Korean Peninsula over the last few weeks. And war attracts attention. War attracts journalists. When wars break out, an event happens, things go bang, blood flows, and people rush and they study it. I think it's very unlikely that we will pick up tomorrow's paper and see a headline that says, "All quiet on the U.S.-Canada border." "All quiet on the Franco-German frontier." And the reason that we won't see that headlines is partly because there's nothing happening on the U.S.-Canadian border. Maybe there are a few anti-terrorism squads. On the Franco-German border, there's nothing. There are no French troops, no German troops, no immigration officers. You don't change money. You don't show a passport. You just zip by. But is it some sense a pity that the headlines isn't all quiet on the U.S.-Canada border? Because that is in some ways as important, if not more important, as war. And I think we tend not to spend enough time studying peace, partly because it's the non-event. It's the dog that doesn't bark. When peace breaks out on the U.S.-Canadian border, nothing happens. There's no noise. No journalists are going to go. No editor is going to put it on his or her front page because nobody really cares. But it is in some ways one of the most profound, magical events in international history because, as we've been talking about most of the morning, international history tends to be the story of geopolitical rivalry, of borders as sites of competition and bloodshed. And so the question that I want to explore in the next 10, 15 minutes is how does that happen? Why is it that that border with Canada is undefended? Why is it that you now drive across the Franco-German boundary line? Why is it that Brazil and Argentina, that spent over 100 years glaring at each other, pointing pistols at each other, now have an undefended border? That's the puzzle. What I want to do is sort of three things. One is to very briefly give you the story, what I found when I went out and tried to answer this question. What's just the sequence of steps? Second thing I want to do is give you a quick set of takeaways, a few nuggets that you can put in your pocket to mull over when you're on your third beer tonight over at the Officers Club. And then the third thing I want to do is cycle back to where I started and say a few things about Obama's outreach to adversaries, how it's going, where it should go. In the book that I think earned me the invitation today, I look at 20 different historical cases of long-standing rivalries that end in peace. Half of the cases that I look at are successful, that is to say, you go from enmity to amity, and half the cases are unsuccessful. That is, you start down the path toward amity, but you end up enemies. The earliest case I look at is the Swiss Confederation that began in 1291, the origins of what is today Switzerland. 3 forest cantons formed a pact. The next case I look at is the Iroquois Confederation, not too far from here in upstate New York. 5 Iroquois tribes that spent hundreds of years killing each other. And in 1450, they gather around a fire in a town that still exists today called Onondaga. They create what was called the Great Binding Law, an oral law that was not written down until the beginning of this century. And not a single Iroquois warrior died in battle until 1777, when those 5 Iroquois tribes got ensnared in our Revolutionary War. And then I look at a whole host of cases that are much more contemporary. Anglo-American at the turn of the century, which we heard a little bit about this morning. U.S. Internally, the Civil War. Why did our Union fall apart? Why did internal borders become sites of competition again? And then a whole bunch of other cases, some Africa, some Middle East, some East Asia, attempting to cast the net as broadly as possible in terms of both culture, geography, and time. Here's what I found. In all of the cases that I look at, the opening move to peace comes from an act born of strategic necessity, not from an act born of altruism. In all the cases that I look at, the party that begins to move down the road to peace does so because it is driven by some external or internal strategic imperative that makes it wake up and say, we have too many enemies and not enough resources, and the best way to get out of this pickle is to take one of our enemies and to move it into the friend column. So let's talk a little bit about the Anglo-American case, because it's one that some of you may be most familiar with. As Professor Strauss was saying this morning, the British found themselves over the course of the late 1800s going from a strong sense of hegemony, unipolarity, if you will, to, by the end of the 19th century, worrying about a decreasing ability to keep resources and commitments in balance. And trouble starts to brew in the mid-1890s because the British are confronted with the rise of 3 simultaneous peer competitors, or potential peer competitors, us, the Germans, and the Japanese. And the Boer War is starting to bubble up in South Africa. Then in 1895, a dispute breaks out between Venezuela and British Guiana over the border. And the United States, which is feeling a little bit uppity at this time, sends a message to London that says, oh, by the way, Venezuela and British Guiana are in the Western Hemisphere. We are the Lord of the Western Hemisphere. We should have a say in how this dispute is resolved. Lord Salisbury, who was the the head of the cabinet, the prime minister, sends a message back to Washington that says, buzz off. Then you start to hear talk of war in Washington. Congress starts debating resolutions that feel, smell, and taste of potential war between the US and the UK. The British Admiralty then gets involved and says to the cabinet, we can't do this. We cannot go to war with the United States. We don't have the battleships. We've got Germany coming online. We've got the Japanese building battleships and actually beating the Russians eventually in a naval engagement. And we've got the uprising in South Africa. We simply can't do it. And the cabinet says, well, if we can't do it, if we can't go to war with the United States, then let's try moving them into the friend column. And Lord Salisbury sends a second message to Washington, and this time it says, we've rethought your position. And in second take, we decide that you're right, and that we will submit this dispute to arbitration. We would like to move this dispute off to the side. Not only did that occur, but Arthur Balfour, the leader of the majority party in the House of Commons, gives a speech in which he says, lo and behold, we British recognize, honor, and respect the Monroe Doctrine. We recognize the emergence of the United States as the nascent hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. I'm paraphrasing here. And what is going on in Washington is they're thinking, have these people gone nuts? This is our arch enemy. We fought a war in 1775. We fought a war in 1812. We almost went to war with them again several times in the 19th century. And now they're getting down and telling us that they respect the Monroe Doctrine and they're going to allow us to emerge as the hegemon. Well, what that does is it raps the knuckles on the window of American policymakers. And it says something strange is going on here. The British seem to be telling us that they no longer want to see us as a geopolitical rival. In the book, I use an analogy from a relatively popular film to capture the nature of this opening move. And it's a film that my guess is I will not be the only person in the room to have seen over a dozen times. And that film is The Hunt for Red October. I don't think I'll recount to you what that is about, but it all comes down to one scene in The Hunt for Red October, when Sean Connery, the Soviet commander, is trying to defect. He is being followed by Commander Mancuso, who's played by Scott Glenn. Thank you very much. I told you I wasn't going to be the only person. And then Jack Ryan, is that right? Something Ryan is telling the American commander he's a good guy. He's trying to defect. And eventually the American commander says, you know, I'm going to give this a try. What does he do? He reverses the propeller. And you folks know much more about that than I do. But what it does is it makes noise. In the movie, they call it cavitation, whatever the heck that is. But here you are, right? I know enough about submarine warfare to know that when he doesn't know where you are, you don't say, hello. But what he did is he said, hello, here I am. And Sean Connery says there's only one reason that he would say, here I am. And that's because he's sending me a message that he wants to do business with me. And the next thing you know, they rise to the surface, they're pinging back and forth, they're waving at each other through the periscopes. And about 60 minutes later, Sean Connery is fishing off the coast of Maine. Enemies became friends. That decision by the American commander to reverse his propeller is, in a nutshell, how each of the stories that I look at begins. One of the countries in question does something unusual, exposes itself to some degree to say, let's get out of this box. So let's go back to the Anglo-American case. What happens next? The ball is in the U.S. court. It's now up to the United States to do something to the British that says, we understand what you're saying to us, and we want to play ball with you. And between 1896 and 1898, the British and the Americans exchanged concessions over fishing rights in the Barents Sea, eventually over the building and fortification of the Panama Canal, over the border between Alaska and Canada. And when the United States, which is getting very uppity by this time, in 1898 attacks Spain, kicks them out of Cuba, colonizes the Philippines and other islands in the Pacific, the British get up and say, hooray. The only country in the world to back the American war against Spain, the only European country. And it's by that time that you begin to see friendship breaking out between the United States and Great Britain. So that second stage is an exchange of concessions, of mutual accommodation, of each side doing things to tell the other side, we too want to get away from the rivalry. And then the deal gets closed between 1898 and 1906, and the story gets much more sociological and much less in the realm of diplomacy and high politics. American financiers, British financiers start to get involved. The Anglo-American Chamber of Commerce is born, and they fly the British flag and the American flag behind them. You start to see theater, novels, literature begin to talk about Americans as the kin of the Brits, and Brits as the kin of the Americans. And by 1902, 1903, you're getting President Teddy Roosevelt saying war between the United States and Britain would be a civil war. And his counterpart in London is saying war between our two countries would be fratricide. And if you look at the planning documents, it's at that time that the United States is dropped from the Admiralty's list of the two-power standard for the calculation of its naval strength. In other words, the Brits stop planning for war against the United States. In 1906, the last contingent of British regulars leaves Canada. The U.S. continued to draft war plans for Britain beyond 1906, but most politicians and most military planners did not take them seriously. Essentially, between 1895 and 1906, the United States and Britain, long-standing rivals, had become friends, laying the foundation for the special partnership or special relationship which has lasted to this day. That, in a nutshell, is the story that I find in all of the 20 other cases that I look at. You start with that opening gambit, similar to the Hunt for Red October. You go through a period of 3 to 5 years in which there is a mutual exchange of concessions to build confidence. And then the game comes to an end when the two societies begin to get to know each other, when they start talking about each other as kin, as brothers, as friends, rather than enemies. And it's that discourse change, that change in the way that societies understand each other, that really closes the deal. Because the other, to some extent, becomes the self, and the idea of war against this particular other country starts to enter the realm of the unthinkable. Let me switch tracks here and offer up a few takeaways, a few things that I hope you will put in your pocket or write on your business card to mull after this conference has come to an end. And here I'm going to, I think, give you kind of 6 things that I think are important findings from the research that I've been doing. First, in the big debate that took place in the American presidential campaign between McCain and Obama, one of the most controversial issues was, is engagement appeasement or is engagement good diplomacy? What I found is that engagement under the right circumstances is good diplomacy. That when long-standing rivalries come to an end without war, it is almost always because the two parties sit down and talk to each other. not because one side coerces the other into submission. That does not mean that I would encourage engagement with Al-Qaeda. That does not mean I would encourage engagement with the Nazis. There are regimes out there that have maximalist ideological goals, and yes, then engagement is appeasement. But if you're dealing with an adversary that you think is short of an ideological extremist, engagement is worth a try. The second takeaway, if there is an elixir, a potion that keeps reappearing throughout the 20 historical cases I look at, it is what I would call the practice of strategic restraint. The willingness and ability of the parties in question to withhold power, to step back, to do things intended to demonstrate to the other side that it does not have hostile intent. In the case of the Hunt for Red October, it was reversing the propeller. In the case of Norway and Sweden in 1905, it was Norway beginning to dismantle the forts on the border between the two countries. In the case of Indonesia and Malaysia in 1965-66, it was Suharto sending a peace delegation to Kuala Lumpur, backing off the sanctions and the unwillingness to recognize Malaysia as a new federation. I also found very interesting repetition of different kinds of power management devices across the cases, whether it's the 13th century in Switzerland, the 15th century of the Iroquois tribes, the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, Malaysia. Dispute resolution mechanisms, always very important. And not necessarily that you can resolve disputes. In many of the cases I look at, they would put them aside. And they would deal with the easy cases first. So in the Anglo-American case, they dealt with borders in Latin America, fishing rights. They started to get to know each other. They built confidence. And then they tackled the tough cases. The Panama Canal, the border between Canada and Alaska. Start small. Build confidence. Be willing to put the tough issues aside, and then when you begin to trust each other a little bit more, come back to the tough ones. Also saw the recurrence of many what I would call instruments to deconcentrate power. One of the tough nuts to get around as enemies become friends is power asymmetries. Big states make small states scared. So what do big states do? They do things to make small states feel more comfortable. In the case of the European Union, France and Germany bound one another together, making the small states feel more comfortable. In the concert of Europe, the British actually increased the size of Prussia and gave Austria a sphere of influence in Italy to make those smaller powers feel that they could punch above their weight. Where capitals are placed, very important. Why do I today live in a swamp? Right? I live in a swamp, Washington, D.C., because it's the only place that Americans could agree to put a national capital which wouldn't threaten the South and wouldn't threaten small states. Couldn't be Philly, couldn't be Boston, couldn't be New York. Washington. Partly commercial, partly agrarian, partly north, partly south. Why does Europe today have its main capital in Brussels, and then some of its institutions in Strasbourg and others in Luxembourg, to deconcentrate power? In the case of Switzerland, they couldn't agree on where to put the capital, so they had two. One for the Protestants and one for the Catholics. But it was a way of trying to build confidence among the main geopolitical divides. Third takeaway, and this is surprising to me and perhaps to you because we, as scholars and practitioners, are led to believe in the importance of regime type. That is to say, democracy is good, autocracy is bad. Democracy is pacific, autocracy is warlike. Didn't find it. I found that autocracies could be reliable partners in peace. I found that countries that are nasty at home can still be major negotiators and engagers, and that we should be very careful about writing off other regimes on the basis of their domestic institutions. and pay much more attention to the nature of their foreign policies. The Concert of Europe, big divisions according to regime type. General Suharto, one of the great sons of bitches of the last 50 years, killed hundreds of thousands of communists and ethnic Chinese, was also one of the great peacemakers of Southeast Asia. Brazil and Argentina embarked on the path to peace when they were both ruled by military juntas. Everything else equal, I would rather have Russia and China be democracies. I doubt either will be a democracy anytime soon. In my mind, on the basis of what I found, that doesn't mean that they can't be reliable partners. Let's give them a try. The fourth takeaway, economic interdependence is vastly overrated. Peace is about diplomacy. Peace is the product of diplomacy, not about trade and finance. And I think we are misled by believing that if we can get Japan to invest in China, Israelis to trade with Palestinians, Bosnian Serbs to trade with Bosnian Muslims, that peace will break out. It won't. In only one of the 20 cases that I looked at did economic integration have geopolitical consequence, and that was German unification in the 19th century. In all of the other cases I looked at, the diplomats, the military officers, the naval officers had to do the work, close the deal, get the geopolitics and the politics right, and only then do you see societies begin to integrate in a way that has political consequence. The fifth takeaway, culture matters. In a lot of the cases I look at, some kind of ethnic, religious commonality plays an important role in guiding the parties to peace. Again, coming back to the morning, at the same time that the British tried to make nice to us, they made nice to the Japanese, the 1902 alliance. It worked with us, it didn't work with Japan. One of the reasons it didn't work with Japan was culture. In the case of the United States, there was a sort of outpouring of Anglo-Saxon unity, building on a sense of ancestral commonality and heritage. In the case of the Brits and Japan, a major blockage, to be quite explicit, was racism, was the unwillingness of the British to engage the Japanese in the same way that they engaged the Americans, and partly because of fundamental discomfort at a cultural level. I'm not making an argument here that's similar to Sam Huntington. That is to say, if you're not of the same culture, you're destined to clash. But I am saying that countries that share a similar culture will find it easier to get to peace than those that don't. And that doesn't mean that the US and Iran or the US and China cannot be partners. They can't find a way to rapprochement. But it does mean that I would bet that if China finds itself embedded in some sort of regional structure, or if Iran does, it is more likely to be with its neighbors than it is to be with countries that are much farther afield. Final point, and this will bring me to my final set of comments. Those of us who spend a lot of our time thinking about diplomacy and strategy and foreign policy do ourselves a misservice by not spending enough time studying domestic politics. Because the domestic politics of getting to peace are about as complicated as the diplomacy of getting to peace. And that's because when a leader reaches out to an adversary, he or she sticks his neck way out, as we're seeing with Obama, as we saw with Gorbachev. And that's because there are always opponents at home waiting to take advantage of any effort to reach out to the bad guy. And in the cases where I found failure, where countries start down the path to peace and they don't make it, it's almost always because domestic opponents at home rise up and block it, either out of instrumental effort to come to power or because they are threatened. Because this rapprochement threatens traditional elites. As the two societies get closer together, traditional national security elites, bureaucracies get upset and they stop it. And in that sense, the domestic impediments to engagement should be front and center as we think about how to move countries from the enemy column to the friend column. Let me end by coming back to Obama and the current effort to reach out. As you might guess, I think Obama has been doing the right thing. I think that in the effort to push the reset with the Russians, in the effort to negotiate with Iran, in the beginnings of the dialogue with Cuba, this is not just the right diplomacy, it's courageous diplomacy. It may not work, but at least on the basis of the work I've been doing, it has the possibility of working. You do it with your eyes wide open. If it doesn't work, you raise your guard, but at least you give it a shot. I think Obama has made significant progress in the course of 2010 by moving his diplomacy from one which was too much about talk and not enough about action to one which is now more about action. And in some ways, Obama is one of the great political insurgents of modern political American history. It doesn't surprise me that Obama beat John McCain. The Republicans, to be rather blunt, had a bad brand in the last election. It does surprise me, in fact, it shocks me that Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton owned the Democratic Party, literally and figuratively. And Obama was able to get around that by essentially carrying out one of the great grassroots insurgencies in American history. Went right over the party establishment and was able to unseat that establishment to get the nomination. I think he did the same thing as president for the first year. He rose above partisan politics at home and abroad. He gave speeches, he gave town halls. It was all about public diplomacy. But he found that it didn't get him a lot. And I think what we've seen over the last few months is a president who is starting to roll up his sleeves, who's getting into the trenches, who's cutting deals at home and abroad, who's starting to do the dirty, if you will, negotiating that is required in dealing with both enemies and friends. Obama needs more success, particularly because he faces opposition at home. I think the START agreement is very important because it gives Obama the ability to say, here is what we get when we talk to countries with whom we have troubled relations. I hope he has more in his quiver by the time we get to the midterms. It would be great if the Chinese would appreciate the value of the yuan. It would be great if Iran would make a deal on its enrichment facilities. I'm not holding my breath on either, but those are the kinds of wins that Obama needs to get more political support for what he's doing. As I said, it's politically dangerous. And part of the problem now is that Washington has very little political patience. Political time is measured in seconds and minutes, not in months and years. And engaging the adversary takes years. It takes 2, 3, 4 years just to get through those initial stages that I was talking about. And in this respect, I worry as much about the politics of engagement in Washington as I do about the politics of engagement in Beijing, Moscow, Havana, or Tehran. And I really do worry that Obama may actually get to yes on some of these fronts, bring those deals back home to the Senate, like START or like CTBT, and see the efforts go down in flames. Because I do think that we are living through one of the most polarized moments in American history. And that polarization ties the hands of diplomats who are trying to do courageous things. Let me end on a final note that is somewhat more upbeat. If there is, I think, a place where the two parties may find common ground when it comes to foreign policy, it is for a restoration of what I would call political and economic solvency to our grand strategy, to our engagement abroad. And I think that because of the deficits, because of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, hopefully not Iran, we'll see, because of the sense that the United States has to try to economize, I do think that we may be heading toward an agreement on a grand strategy that relies more on diplomacy, and perhaps less on the use of force. And in many respects, the best use of force is the use of force that never happens. It's the use of force that succeeds through persuasion rather than coercion. So to the degree that I think that the parties may be able to come together on a package of engagement of this sort, of trying to turn some of our enemies into friends, I think it could come just like the British, from a sense that American commitments and American resources are starting to get out of whack. And one way to bring our commitments and our resources back into balance is through diplomacy. Thank you very much. Be more than happy to take your questions on these or other issues. Please.
Thank you. My name is Jay Strauss from the Foundation. I just returned from a trip from Ukraine and Georgia, and those people are scared. And I noticed the reset. I noticed the detachment of U.S. soldiers marching in a May Day parade in Red Square. I thought they'd never live to see that. But the United States has just established a Patriot missile defense battery in Poland, 37 kilometers from the Russian border. What's going on here?
Well, this is an issue that Mary began to talk about this morning, and I think it's an issue where we find ourselves in a somewhat awkward position. Like Mary, I'm someone who believes that Russia is to some extent the prize, and that we have been somewhat short-sighted in proceeding with the construction of a post-Cold War settlement that cuts Russia out. Now, Russia is out in part for its own reasons, its own stupidity, its own foreign policy excesses. But I think that we can do more to try to make Russia a stakeholder in the Euro-Atlantic order. And I recently published an article, as Mary mentioned, that explores the possibility of Russia one day joining NATO. But I think what's happening right now is that we are, to some extent, stuck on the horns of the policies that we put in place later, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with it. On the one hand, we're trying to get Russia into the game. We are easing off on the enlargement of NATO to Georgia and Ukraine because that would be seen by the Russians as extremely provocative. But at the same time, we need to give reassurance to our traditional allies in Central Europe that we are not selling them down the stream. And that's why we just put Patriot missiles in Poland. That's why the strategic concept paper that Madeleine Albright oversaw talks about Article 5 and the effort to reassure allies about the integrity of Article 5. So basically right now, what we're doing right now is a tap dance. We are trying to keep the Central Europeans from going crazy and not sleeping at night because they think the Russians are about to invade. But at the same time, we're trying to ease off on the question of Russia's near abroad to give Moscow some breathing room, to strike deals with Moscow on arms control, maybe on Iran, maybe on Afghanistan. And as I said earlier, let's start on those small issues, and maybe we'll find 2, 3, 4 years from now that we can find common ground on NATO enlargement, on Kosovo, on Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. We're not there yet, but if the research I've been doing is of any use, let's build up the confidence with small steps and then take on the tough ones.
I have a related question.
Yes, wherever you are.
I'm over here.
Oh, please.
I read your article in Foreign Affairs. It was excellent. And I have 2 quick questions. I wonder what senators, congressmen, international leaders, prominent Americans, and others are, joining with you to support the idea that Russia join the Atlantic Alliance. Who's behind this? Where's the firepower going to come from? And what can the audience do if you happen to feel that way? Secondly, I'd be interested in your thoughts about if the euro becomes a completely dysfunctional currency, how will that affect the future of the EU, major nations throughout the world, and for that matter, international commerce.
Did you say I had 2 hours, or? On the first question, I would say that how many congressmen and senators are lining up behind the proposition to get Russia into NATO? None. The responses that I've been getting to the piece have been surprisingly positive, in the sense that more people than I thought have said to me, it's a crazy idea, but it makes a lot of sense. And so in that regard, it's an idea whose time has not come, but I think it's useful to put it into the mix, that it needs to be part of the discussion. And it's conceivable to me that in 2012, if things go right, you could walk into the Senate and have a serious discussion about NATO and Russia. That you could go to Warsaw and say, you have a greater interest than anyone in having Russia in the Euro-Atlantic order. Because if Russia doesn't like Europe, you live in an unpleasant geopolitical space. If we resolve the Russia question, your security problem goes away. We're not there yet, but it's worth opening the discussion. The second question, I think there are two different ways to parse the crisis in Europe. One is all about the global financial crisis, the stability of the euro, the potential for further declines in the value of the euro to frighten the markets and bring the Dow and other indexes down. I think that's probably likely. I worry about something else, and that is about the impact of this crisis on the European Union. And I think that the European Union is, like the undefended US-Canada border, one of the great geopolitical successes of our time. I worry that it is getting shaky, that there is across Europe a renationalization of political life that is undoing the process that I talked about of concessions, societal integration, generation of a common narrative. You now have in Germany a leadership for whom Europe no longer is an animating motive. Merkel doesn't talk very much about the European vocation of Germany. She talks about the German national interest. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that Germany is to some extent finding normalcy. But it is a bad thing if Europe starts to come apart. If Europeans find themselves questioning whether they can count on their neighbors, and Americans have to start worrying about whether Europe has escaped geopolitical rivalry, then we are radically turning back the clock in a negative way. I don't think we're close to that, but I do think that the Europeans need to wake up and realize that their union is as threatened today as it has been since any time after World War II, and that they need to breathe new life into the process of integration before things get worse. Sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry? Thank you.
You can just shout it out and I'll repeat it.
This ties into your last question, and that is, could you talk about the forging of peace between France and Germany, given two perspectives? One was the depth of their enmity, of hatreds, of invasions, occupations, and the second, from something you said earlier, that diplomacy is more important than economics, because the legend is that Jean Monnet created that friendship through the economic perspective.
The question was about the fashioning of the Franco-German partnership after World War II. In some ways your question ties back to the previous question about political support for NATO enlargement. Right now it's outside the envelope politically. In 1950, the rearmament of Germany was outside the political box. And you have to sort of get yourself into the frame of mind of the ability of acts of rapprochement to radically change politics. I mean, what France and Germany did between 1947, 48, and the Élysée Treaty in 1963 is revolutionary. They put the past behind them, and they really created the engine of Europe. It happens. It's difficult. It takes hard work, but it happens. I think the common narrative of European integration is, as you said, that it was primarily about trade. But I think the better interpretation is that it was about trade in the service of geopolitics. The coal and steel community was about coal and steel. But what was it really about? Making sure that Germany and France would never go to war again. And when French leaders and German leaders proposed to the private sector that this was happening, the private sector said, "Over my dead body." The French steel and coal industry refused to give data to the French government on coal and steel production because they wanted nothing to do with the plan. And the geopoliticians, the leaders, then forced the private sector to make the deal. And then economic integration starts. But the project of Europe has really been geopolitical in the superstructure and the substructure. But on top, what you see is economic integration. Sir?
Yes, we heard a lot about Chinese submarines this morning. How can we build better ties with China? We hear a lot of worry about their armed forces. How can we build small steps there? And is this one case where the economic ties we have by Chinese holding all our bonds, our warfare options?
I think small steps is... The question was, where are we on Sino-American relations, and what can we do to push that relationship in a better direction? I think that the last few months have pushed the relationship in a better direction. We were, in February, March, I think, on a slippery slope because of the value of the yuan, because of the Dalai Lama issue, the arms sales to Taiwan, the Chinese government getting more and more heated in response to those moves. And then since the late spring, we seem to have sort of backed off. And there has been, I think, a ceasefire from both sides, giving breathing room. But as I said earlier, this now is about domestic politics. It is about the Chinese leadership feeling that any time the U.S. pressures them, they have to push back. And in the United States, it's about pressure on Obama to deal with the trade imbalance and the currency issue, as well as those who are criticizing him for not standing up to autocratic governments. But I think that in the interim, we should try to find workable daily kinds of activities, military maneuvers, discussions, the strategic dialogue that just took place, engage them for now. On the whole question of where China is headed, we don't know. I think someone this morning said that Gates, the secretary recently said, the more resolve we show to China, the better. I'm not so sure. That's because I don't know yet whether China is a revisionist state that will require us to stand up to them and contain them, or whether China is a country with which we can do business, in which case we should do to them what the Brits did to us. That is, give them some breathing room. And we won't be able to answer that question for another 5 to 10 years, simply because China is not at a stage where it's making that decision. But I do think, and this will be particularly of interest to the Navy, I do think that inevitably, by 2020, by 2025, we as Americans will face a choice not unsimilar to the choice that Europeans faced in the Western Hemisphere. It's unimaginable to me that when China becomes a power of the first rank, they will not say, we would like to be dominant in our neighborhood. That's what great powers do. The American Navy now occupies a very comfortable berth from Korea to Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, right along that rim where the Chinese are going to say, hey, this is our yard. They're going to say, you had a Monroe Doctrine, we want a Monroe Doctrine. I think that's inevitable. Now's the time to start thinking about how we should react to that. And how we should react to that, I think, is going to be a function of Chinese intentions and our view of whether we think they're a revisionist power or a status quo great power with whom we can do business like the British did business with us. One more question, please.
Hi, Alex Vaca from Northrop Grumman. If I took something away from Professor Strawn's discussion earlier this morning, it was in the parable of Britain at the time, their decision to build alliances had two effects. The first was that they lost the ability to send an unambiguous message at a time when they really needed to, in the years right before World War I. And the second was that they were tied into partners who were not entirely sharing exactly the same interests that they had at the same time, and they created in the remaining people who were in the potential rivals column a sense of encirclement. So to use your vernacular, as you move someone from an enemy column or an undecided column to a friend column, everybody else begins to feel a little bit more insecure because it looks like encirclement. So as we start to think about that parable and your own notions of engagement, how should we try and go about crafting a structure so that we don't encourage these pathologies and we're able to sort of control the system when we need it? Thank you.
I have a somewhat different take on British strategy before World War I. I would give it a much more positive gloss in the sense that I see it as one of the most impressive decades of strategic adjustment in recent memory. And that's in part because the British had a far-flung empire, and they had been basing their grand strategy on splendid isolation in many ways all the way back to Queen Elizabeth. And in the space of a relatively short period of time, under the guidance of Fisher and others, they engaged in a fleet redistribution which was quite remarkable. They fashioned rapprochement with the United States. They closed an alliance with the Japanese. They started bringing the battleships home into the Med, and then after striking a deal with the French from the Med into home waters, all because they knew that if the heart of the empire is threatened, the far-flung limbs become relatively irrelevant. Now, did the British do what they should have done to prepare for war on the continent? No. But I think that their mix of redistribution of naval assets plus diplomacy with the United States, diplomacy with France, diplomacy with the United States was exactly the kind of synthetic mix of grand strategic alliance and diplomacy that I think great powers need to do when the world starts to change as it did then. We are now going through a period in history in which that kind of change will again be experienced. So the lesson that I would take away from that period would be, as the world begins to change, as American primacy begins to be challenged gradually by the rise of others, we need to be fleet-footed in terms of how we deploy our forces, buy our forces, but also diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy needs to be a more important part of our overall national strategy. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me grab my badge.
Okay, if you just give us a couple minutes, we'll go right into the panel. I just need to set up on the stage here.